In the upper wing of Viremont Hall, silence was not just a condition, it was a rule. Every step echoed like a confession. Every whisper risked becoming a scandal. That night, however, silence was broken by something far more dangerous than sound: a scream. It came from the sealed inner chamber behind the black oak doors of the east corridor, a voice sharp enough to slice through velvet curtains and ancestral pride alike.
"Don't stop, my Duke!"
Don't stop, my Duke. The words did not belong in a house like Viremont. They did not belong in any house where portraits of forgotten nobles watched from gilded frames and where chandeliers hung like frozen stars. And yet, they were spoken and heard. Down the corridor, attendants froze mid-step. A silver tray tilted in the hands of a young servant, glass trembling but not yet falling. Two guards, stationed at the far archway, instinctively turned their heads toward the sealed door, as if the wood itself had begun to breathe. Inside that chamber, no one knew what truly continued. But outside, everything stopped. Earlier that evening, Viremont Hall had been calm in its usual controlled chaos. The estate was preparing for the return of Duke Calum Rise, the last heir of House Rise, a man known for his precision in diplomacy and his frightening calm in matters of power. He had returned after months away in the Northern Territories, where political unrest had quietly bled entire provinces into silence. No one expected him to return with anything more than documents, fatigue, and his usual unreadable expression. But he had not returned alone. A woman had arrived with him, not a noblewoman, not a known envoy, not anyone who belonged in the long line of aristocratic recognition. Her name, whispered only once in the servants' quarters, was Alaris Venn. She had stepped into Viremont Hall wearing a travel-worn cloak, her presence quiet but unsettling like a storm that had not yet decided when to break. No one knew where she had come from. No one dared ask Calum directly. And that alone made her presence more dangerous than any official decree. By the time night settled, the estate had already begun to shift. Doors closed earlier than usual. Servants avoided the east wing. Even the older staff, who had served under 3 generations of Rise rule, spoke in lowered tones. Because the Duke had issued a private order, no one enters the East Chamber until dawn. That alone would have been ordinary if not for what followed, if not for the sound that came hours later, if not for the scream that shattered every assumption the house had ever held about control, dignity, and restraint. Don't stop, my Duke. It was not just the words. It was the urgency behind them. The rawness, the way it carried through locked doors as if the walls themselves had chosen to betray secrecy. And then silence again, a heavier silence this time, one that did not feel empty, but full, too full, as if something irreversible had just been spoken into existence. Down the corridor, Lady Maribel Orenth stood motionless, one hand pressed lightly against the marble pillar for balance. She had served Viremont for 15 years. She had witnessed negotiations that ended wars and betrayals that erased bloodlines, but nothing in her experience prepared her for the sound that had just escaped that room. Her eyes flicked toward the guards. One of them swallowed hard. The other avoided eye contact entirely. No one spoke, because speaking would make it real. And whatever was happening behind that door was not meant to become real in the world of etiquette and noble restraint. Far above, in the chamber itself, faint light spilled beneath the doorframe. Shadows moved across the carved panels like shifting secrets, and somewhere within, Duke Calum Rise remained unseen. So did Alaris Venn. Whatever had begun between them was now sealed inside that room, separated from the world that believed it still understood power, hierarchy, and control. But outside, the hallways had already changed. The house had already started listening differently. Even the air felt aware, and then, as if the estate itself could no longer bear the tension, a final sound broke through the stillness. Not a scream this time, not a voice, but the soft collapse of something heavy against wood, followed by absolute silence. The kind of silence that does not end conversations, but begins consequences. If this story pulled you in, share your thought on what you think is really happening behind those doors. And don't forget to subscribe to Sandy Love Tales for more emotionally charged tales that blur the line between power, passion, and secrecy. The silence in Viremont Hall did not break after the first scream. It deepened. It settled into the walls like a living thing, pressing against every corridor, every pillar, every breath taken too loudly. Outside the sealed black oak door of the east chamber, the entire household remained frozen in a state of suspended disbelief, as if time itself had refused to continue without permission from what lay inside. Then it happened again. A sound, sharper this time, more controlled yet far more dangerous in implication.
Stop, my Duke!
Don't stop, my Duke. The voice carried differently now, not as a burst of shock, but as something deliberate, something that made the listeners outside the chamber instinctively shift their weight backward, as if distance could undo what they had heard. Lady Maribel Orent's hand tightened against the marble pillar until her knuckles paled. Her breath caught once, uneven, as her eyes darted briefly toward the guards. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. But the tension in their bodies had changed. Less confusion now, more dread. Because confusion could be dismissed. Dread meant understanding was beginning to form. Inside the chamber, faint movement shadows shifted beneath the door again. The golden light, leaking from the crack, flickered unevenly, as though responding to motion within. A soft creak of wood followed, subtle but audible to those standing closest outside. It was not the sound of forced entry. It was not resistance. It was continuation. Down the corridor, one of the younger attendants instinctively took a step back, tray trembling in his hands before he forced himself still. Another servant whispered a prayer under her breath, though no deity in the House of Rise had ever been known to answer questions involving forbidden chambers. The Duke's return had always carried weight, but never unpredictability. Duke Calum Rice was known for silence more than speech, for calculation more than impulse. Yet tonight, the estate was hearing something entirely incompatible with that reputation. And worse, it was not just the voice of Elleris Venn that unsettled them. It was the absence of interruption. No command from the Duke, no rejection, no correction, nothing that confirmed order still existed behind that door. Only continuation. Only that voice repeating what should not have been spoken so freely in a house built on control. Don't stop, my Duke. The words echoed again, softer this time, but more intimate, as if the distance between speaker and listener had vanished entirely. A guard near the archway clenched his jaw so tightly it ached, eyes fixed on the door as though expecting it to answer for itself. Another shifted his spear, the metal tip scraping faintly against stone, an accidental sound that felt too loud in the suffocating stillness that followed. Lady Maribel turned her head slightly, her voice finally breaking the silence in a whisper so controlled it barely existed. "This is not possible," she said, though she did not know what "this" referred to anymore. The guards did not respond. They could not afford to. Because whatever was happening behind that door was no longer a matter of rumor or misunderstanding. It was presence. It was certainty, without explanation. And Viremont Hall had never tolerated certainty it could not categorize. A faint thud came from inside the chamber, low, dull, and immediately followed by stillness so absolute it felt intentional. Then, a pause long enough for every listener in the corridor to become aware of their own breathing again. Too loud. Too human, too involved. The golden glow under the door narrowed, then steadied, as though whatever had shifted inside had settled into a new state. Not ending, not stopping, continuing. One of the older attendants finally spoke, voice trembling despite years of disciplined service. "Should we inform the steward?" No one answered. Because informing the steward would mean acknowledging that something was happening, and acknowledging it would make it real in a way no one was prepared to defend. Above all of them, the estate itself seemed unchanged on the surface. Same stone, same chandeliers, same portraits watching from gilded frames, but beneath that surface, something had already begun to fracture. Not loudly, not visibly, but irreversibly. And inside the sealed chamber, the voice of Elleris Venn faded into a softer tone, no longer calling out, but speaking as if she no longer needed to be heard outside the room at all. The corridor remained locked in its vigil, waiting for the moment when the door would either open or never explain itself again. The silence inside Viremont Hall did not remain empty for long. It evolved. It thickened, becoming something heavier than sound itself, something that pressed against the ribs of every servant, guard, and noble still standing in the east wing corridor. The sealed black oak door remained unchanged on the surface, but everything around it had shifted in perception, as if the estate had begun to reinterpret what it meant to wait. Then, without warning, the faint golden glow beneath the door intensified briefly, as though responding to movement within the chamber, followed by a soft sound wood settling, or perhaps something more deliberate. No voice followed immediately, no scream, no command, only anticipation stretched thin enough to fracture. Lady Maribel Orenthe had not moved from her position beside the marble pillar. Her posture was still rigid, but now less from shock and more from the burden of interpretation. Her eyes remained fixed on the door, as if trying to extract meaning from its silence. One of the guards finally shifted his stance, spear lowering slightly before he corrected himself, jaw clenched with visible restraint. The other guard exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that betrayed unease he refused to voice. No one spoke the obvious question forming in every mind. Why had nothing been denied? In a house like Viremont, absence of denial was never neutral. It was confirmation by omission. Down the corridor, a younger attendant took a hesitant step forward before stopping abruptly, as if crossing an invisible boundary of authority. The chandeliers above flickered once, then steadied, casting long trembling shadows that stretched toward the sealed chamber door like reaching fingers. The house rise crest carved into the oak seemed sharper under the shifting light, the fractured crown motif appearing almost symbolic in a way no one dared articulate. Then it came again, not a scream this time, not even a voice, but a faint sound of breath from within the chamber, barely audible through stone and wood, yet unmistakably human. That single detail altered the atmosphere completely, because breath meant presence, presence meant continuity. Continuity meant nothing had ended. Lady Maribel's lips parted slightly, though no words emerged. Her composure, so carefully maintained, now carried a subtle fracture at the edges. She turned her head just enough to glance at the nearest guard, searching for reassurance that neither of them could offer. The guard avoided her gaze. Inside the chamber, a soft rustle of fabric could be faintly perceived through the door, followed by another brief pause that felt intentionally measured, as if someone inside was deciding how much of themselves should be revealed to the world outside. The golden light under the door shifted again, narrowing into a thin line before widening slightly, as though the space inside had changed configuration. A servant near the back of the corridor whispered unintentionally, "They're still inside." The words hung in the air longer than intended. No one corrected her. No one contradicted her. Because for the first time, denial felt less credible than acceptance. The Duke had not emerged. The woman had not been silenced. And whatever hierarchy existed in that chamber was no longer accessible to those outside it. A faint metallic sound followed, subtle, indistinct. Possibly the adjustment of an object or the shifting of weight against wood or floor, but it was enough to make two attendants instinctively step back. The corridor itself seemed to respond, candle flames wavering in synchronized hesitation. The estate, so accustomed to authority and structure, now appeared uncertain of its own rules. Lady Maribel finally spoke again, voice lower than before, controlled but strained. "We will not open that door," she said, though it sounded less like an instruction and more like a boundary being acknowledged. No one disagreed. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was watchful. And behind the sealed black oak door, the presence inside did not retreat. It remained, unresolved, uninterrupted, and fully aware it was being listened to. If you're following this story, comment and tell me what you think is truly happening behind the sealed chamber, and don't forget to subscribe to Sandy Love Tales for more emotionally intense, cinematic tales like this. The corridor in Viremont Hall felt different now, not quieter, but heavier, as if silence itself had gained mass and was pressing down on every living presence within it. The sealed black oak door at the end of the east wing corridor remained unchanged on the surface, yet every detail around it seemed sharper, more accusatory under the flickering chandeliers. The faint golden line beneath the door persisted, but it no longer pulsed like before. Instead, it held steady, deliberate, as though whatever was inside had settled into awareness of being observed. No one in the corridor dared to move closer. Even breathing felt negotiated. Lady Maribel Orenth remained beside the marble pillar, her posture still composed but now strained at the edges. As if her body had accepted the tension her mind refused to fully articulate. Her emerald eyes stayed locked on the sealed door, and for the first time, uncertainty replaced shock entirely. The guards had shifted subtly as well. Their spears were no longer angled aggressively, but held in a neutral readiness that suggested confusion rather than authority. One of them swallowed hard before speaking in a low voice that barely broke the air. "There is no sound now," he said, as if confirming a fact that might somehow change the situation. No one responded, because everyone knew that silence was not relief, it was transition. Somewhere deeper in the corridor, a faint draft moved through the chandeliers, causing them to sway just enough to distort the shadows on the walls. The ancestral carvings along the stone seemed to shift with that movement, faces of long-dead nobles appearing almost observant under changing light. The sealed chamber remained closed. It offered nothing. No confirmation, no denial, only existence behind restraint. Then, unexpectedly, a soft impact came from inside, not forceful, not violent, but intentional. A sound like something being set down carefully on a surface. The effect in the corridor was immediate. One attendant instinctively stepped back, nearly colliding with another who had frozen mid-motion. Lady Maribel's fingers tightened slightly against the marble pillar again, her controlled composure fracturing just enough to reveal that she was now actively interpreting rather than merely witnessing. The guards exchanged a brief glance, both unwilling to be the first to assign meaning to what they had just heard. And then came a second sound, lighter, almost imperceptible, like fabric shifting against movement. It confirmed what silence had been hiding. Nothing inside had ended. Everything inside was continuing with intention. The golden light under the door narrowed again, becoming a thin, controlled line, as if the space within had been deliberately minimized or redefined. One of the younger servants, unable to maintain composure any longer, whispered without meaning to, "Why is it still not opening?" The question was not directed at anyone, but it spread anyway, because it was the only question that mattered now. Lady Maribel finally straightened slightly, her voice calm but edged with something colder than fear. "Because it was never meant to open for us," she said quietly. The words did not resolve anything, they only deepened the uncertainty. The corridor seemed to accept this interpretation without resistance, as though the estate itself had begun to adjust its understanding of authority. Inside the chamber, there was no further sound, no voice, no command, no interruption. Only presence, contained and uninterrupted by the world outside. And that was more unsettling than any scream that had come before it, because it suggested control, not chaos. The sealed door stood as the only boundary between what was known and what was no longer willing to be defined by those watching it. And in that tension, Viremont Hall waited, as if expecting the next rule to be rewritten without warning. If you are watching this story unfold, comment where you're watching from in the world. I want to see how far this tale has reached, and don't forget to subscribe to Sandy Love Tales for more cinematic, emotionally intense stories like this one. The moment felt less like an ending and more like an unveiling that had been delayed on purpose. Viremont Hall's East Wing corridor stood frozen in an almost reverent silence, the kind that does not come from peace, but from restraint so tight it begins to feel like pressure in the air itself. The sealed black oak double door at the end of the corridor remained closed, unchanged in structure, yet completely different in meaning. The faint golden line beneath it now pulsed faintly once, then steadied, as if acknowledging the presence of those waiting outside without offering explanation. Then, without warning, the sound of movement came, not loud, not dramatic, but deliberate. A single step from inside the chamber. That was all it took for the entire corridor to shift emotionally. Every guard, servant, and noble present instinctively held their breath. Lady Maribel Orenth did not move from her position beside the marble pillar, but her expression changed for the first time from interpretation to certainty. Whatever was behind that door was no longer unknown. It was simply unseen. A slow creak of wood followed, subtle and controlled, as if the door itself was being acknowledged from the inside rather than forced open. The house rise crest caught the candlelight differently now, the fractured crown motif appearing sharper, almost symbolic in its stillness. The guards tightened their grips instinctively, spears angled in restrained readiness, but no one stepped forward. Because forward implied authority, and authority no longer felt clearly defined. Then the sealed black oak door finally moved, not violently, not suddenly, but with a controlled, measured opening that suggested intention rather than escape. A narrow gap formed, releasing a faint, warmer glow from within that contrasted with the cold corridor light. The first thing visible was not chaos, it was order. Inside the chamber, the lighting was steadier than expected, almost calm. Shadows moved minimally, and standing near the threshold was Duke Calum Rise. His presence was unchanged in appearance, but altered in perception. His posture remained composed, his expression unreadable as ever, yet the silence around him now carried a different weight than before. He did not immediately speak. Instead, he looked down the corridor slowly, acknowledging every person present without urgency or concern. The atmosphere shifted again, not into relief, but into recalibration. Behind him, barely visible within the chamber's deeper shadows, stood Eloris Venn. Her presence was no longer whispered or imagined. She was simply there, steady, composed, her expression unreadable in a way that no longer invited speculation, but discouraged it. No one in the corridor moved, not even the guards, because what they had expected and what they were seeing did not align in any predictable way. Lady Maribel's voice finally broke the silence, controlled but edged with restrained demand. "My Duke," she began, then stopped, as if realizing that question itself had become irrelevant. Calum Rees stepped just slightly forward, enough for the corridor to fully see him, but not enough to abandon the threshold behind him. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured, without defense or hesitation. "Nothing here is as you assumed," he said. The words did not explain. They did not justify. They only reframed. A murmur threatened to rise among the attendants, but died before it formed, because explanation was not what they were being offered. Revelation was. Eloris Venn remained within the chamber, unmoving, her gaze steady but distant, as though the corridor outside was no longer part of her immediate concern. The Duke's presence between both spaces inside and outside made the boundary feel less like a door and more like a decision. One guard finally lowered his spear fully, not in surrender, but in confusion that had exceeded protocol. Lady Maribel's expression tightened slightly, not in shock anymore, but in realization that whatever truth existed here would not be simplified for comfort. Calum Reese's eyes moved once more across the corridor, and for the first time, the weight of his authority felt not absent but redefined. "You may choose what story you carry from this moment," he said quietly. The corridor remained silent, not because it had nothing to say, but because it no longer trusted what it understood. And then, after a pause long enough to feel like judgment without verdict, the Duke stepped slightly back into the chamber, leaving the door partially open, not closed, not open, but unresolved. The golden light from within spilled softly into the corridor, mixing with candlelight, blending truth with uncertainty in a way no one could fully separate. The estate did not return to normal. It simply continued differently. And in that continuation, Viremont Hall kept its secret not by hiding it, but by making sure no single explanation could ever fully contain it again. If this story reached you, share your view on what you think the truth behind the chamber really was, and don't forget to subscribe to Sandy Love Tales for more cinematic, emotionally charged stories that blur power, secrecy, and desire.